Hello everyone. I invite you to another series of historical stories tonight. Months ago, I made a video about gemstones in general, and in it, I told you about the stories of famous gems like the Koh-i-Noor diamond. Tonight we're going to explore the stories of other famous diamonds, like the Hope Diamond or the Cullinan Diamond, also known as the Star of Africa, which is a fragment of it. And even though it is not a gem, I'll tell you the story of the affair of the diamond necklace, or affair of the Queen's necklace, a scandal that happened in France a few years before the Revolution, and it contributed to ruin the reputation of the Queen Marie-Antoinette. So, make yourself comfortable. As always, you have the timestamps in the first comment, together with links to streaming services, to Patreon if you wish to support this channel, and also to the 1 month free trial of the Slumber app if you wish to try it. But without waiting more, let's begin our exploration with the story of the Hope Diamond that will take us from India to France to the United Kingdom and finally to the United States. If one day you go to the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., one of the most famous pieces of its collections that you will be able to see there is the Hope Diamond. It is not the biggest in the world. It has the size of a walnut. It weighs 45 carats, or a bit more than 9 grams. 1 carat is a fifth of a gram. And we will discover much bigger diamonds later. But it is one of the most famous, if not the most famous diamond in the entire world. Why is that? First, because of its particular color. It is a blue diamond. It is made of carbon, like all diamonds, but it contains traces of boron that give it its particular color. Its clarity, its purity are exceptional, but there are other almost perfect blue diamonds. What makes it particularly famous is its legend and its history. It changed hands multiple times, and these hands were famous. To explore all this, we need to go back in time more than 300 years ago. And our story begins in India. The Hope Diamond is a Golconda diamond, meaning that it comes from a mine that was on the territory of the Golconda Kingdom in modern India. This is in the state of Andhra Pradesh, in the southeast of India. The mines of Golconda produced some of the biggest, the purest, and the most famous diamonds in the world. And as soon as Europeans established contact with India by the seas, they opened direct trade between Indian states and Western Europe. The extraordinary gemstones that existed there or remain to be found excited the appetite of kings, of aristocrats and collectors. And so, together with spices and precious fabrics, Indian diamonds began to reach Europe. Not just extraordinary diamonds, but stones of all sizes and qualities that European gem merchants looked for. Merchants or thieves sometimes, because many diamonds were also extorted or looted in military expedition along the centuries. The Hope diamond appeared first in the hands of a French merchant who had made several trips to India. His name was Jean-Baptiste Tavernier. The exact origins of the stone are unclear. Maybe it had been found long before, but it was acquired by him in 1666. He went to India, bought or obtained diamonds, and brought them back to France to sell them to his clients, very wealthy individuals or jewelers. And along his journeys, he brought dozens, possibly hundreds of stones that would be cut in Paris. In 1669, 3 years later, he sold the diamond, together with dozens more, to the most prestigious client possible in France and one of the most avid buyers of gems at the time, Louis XIV, Louis XIV, the Sun King. In 1669, Louis XIV was still young and on the rise. His influence was growing, his wealth was immense, and he had begun to spend it building the Palace of Versailles. He accumulated collections of art, he commissioned expensive furniture, paintings, and jewelry. Extraordinary gems were like trophies that kings would add to their crown jewels and wear on their scepters, their crowns, and their jewelry in general, for pleasure and also because of their taste for luxury, but beyond that, to display their wealth and their power. Louis XIV bought the future Hope diamond and many smaller stones for the equivalent of 147 kilograms of pure gold. This is more than 300 pounds. I say the future Hope diamond because at the time it was very crudely cut, just in a triangular shape, and it weighed more than 100 carats, more than 20 grams. That is to say, it was more than twice its current size. 10 years later, Louis XIV commissioned the court jeweler to recut it, which is always necessary to make diamonds symmetrical and give them facets that reflect light and make them much shinier. The stone was recut to a weight of 67 carats, only a big half of its original size, but still 50% bigger than today. And it was mounted on a cravat pin that Louis XIV wore during ceremonies. The diamond was now the size of a pigeon egg, still quite big for a diamond, and the consensus was that the recutting was a success. It was described in accounts of ceremonies as able to take the breath away, as it reflected light in bluish grey rays. It became known as the Blue Diamond of the Crown of France, or simply the French Blue, and it stayed in this royal collection in the crown jewels for a century. In the decades following the recutting of the diamond, Louis XIV's situation became less favorable. His early wars had been successful, but they were succeeded by longer conflicts against large coalitions of enemies, more and more deadly and expensive but inconclusive, to the point that some of the king's treasures had to be sold to fund the war effort, or at least show that he was participating in it. For example, an entire set of furniture made with silver for the Palace of Versailles was sold, but not the French blue, which symbolically had to stay his property for reasons of prestige because it was already famous. When Louis XIV died in 1715, the diamond remained part of the crown's jewels, and decades passed without affecting its fame as one of the biggest and most perfect cut diamonds in the world. In 1749, the diamond was remounted on an extravagant pendant by the successor of Louis XIV, Louis XV, Louis XV, and the new king had it placed on his Order of the Golden Fleece pendant. The Order of the Golden Fleece is an order of chivalry that was founded in the late Middle Ages. It became purely honorific with time, and it actually still exists today. It has split into two branches, an Austrian branch and a Spanish branch. Membership was and still is awarded to aristocrats associated with the Habsburg and the Bourbon families, and to other sovereigns, the Emperor of Japan or the Queen of England are knights of the order. At the time, in the 18th century, Louis XV had been made a knight of the order because the King of Spain, who was Grand Master of the order, was his relative, and the two countries were allied. So Louis XV had the diamond remounted to be the centerpiece of the pendant showing his belonging to the order for ceremonies. Apart from the French blue, it contained a big red spinel, a semi-precious stone, shaped as a dragon, and dozens of smaller diamonds. After the death of Louis XV, the diamond became the property of his grandson and successor, Louis XVI, but there were other crown jewels, and the piece fell into disuse. The new Queen Marie-Antoinette used to have many crown jewels placed in new settings and combinations for her personal adornment, but the French blue was not one of them, and it remained with other gemstones in a vault. And then the French Revolution happened. The crown jewels were kept with precious furniture in a royal storehouse in the center of Paris. At the beginning of the revolution, there was an attempt to keep the monarchy in place as a constitutional monarchy, so the sovereigns were brought back from Versailles to Paris. But then the war began with neighbors. Louis XVI tried to escape, to reconquer his kingdom from the outside. He was captured and imprisoned. The country was falling deep into civil war, and war on its frontiers too. A new government took radical measures that would be called the Reign of Terror, and in this chaos, thefts and lootings multiplied. In 1792, a group of thieves broke into the royal storehouse, and over several days, they stole most of the crown jewels. Many of them were recovered later, but not the French blue. It disappeared from history for 20 years. 20 years after this theft, as Napoleonic wars were still raging, we are now in 1812, a blue diamond appeared in the hands of a London diamond merchant. It was smaller than the French blue at 45 carats versus 67 for the French blue. But blue diamonds of that size in Europe were very rare at the time. The French blue had disappeared, and the odds were that this was the same stone with a new cut. But there was always a doubt, which was lifted only much later in the years 2000, when precise sketches of the French blue were discovered in archives. The diamond, as it was in the 18th century, was reconstructed in 3D on computers, and it proved that this diamond, that would soon be called the Hope Diamond, was indeed the French blue, because it fitted very tightly around the Hope Diamond, too tightly to allow for the existence of a sister stone of that size. What happened to the diamond between the theft in Paris and the years 1830 is unclear. It was obviously recut. We don't know when or by whom. We don't know whether it was smuggled to the UK immediately or whether it travelled across Europe before. But it is well possible that it was acquired by King George IV of the United Kingdom when it arrived in London. Not as a crown jewel, because there would be records of that, but personally. And later it could have been stolen or sold discreetly to cover the many debts that the king left when he died. In any case, with the exception of this merchant who owned it in 1812, there are very little traces of what happened to the diamond between 1792 and the 1830s. If the British royal family owned it at a point, it did not retain it, and the stone ended up in the hands of a London banker named Thomas Hope, who paid for it. After 1839, the diamond can be traced much more closely, thanks to a variety of records and sources. In 1839, it appeared in a catalogue of the gem collection of Thomas Hope's brother, Henry Philip Hope. The diamond was now set in a simple medallion, surrounded by many smaller white diamonds. That same year, in 1839, Henry Philip Hope died without children, and his three nephews fought in court for 10 years over his inheritance, which was finally split into 3 parts, and one of them got the Hope Diamond. Its fame rose again in the 1840s and beyond, even though at the time it was unsure whether this was the French blue or an entirely different diamond. But it was an object of scientific curiosity, and crowds were excited to see it. Most of the time it stayed in a bank vault, but it was displayed in 1851 in London at the Great Exhibition. The Great Exhibition was the first international exhibition. It is also known as the Crystal Palace Exhibition, that started the tradition of World's Fairs. It also appeared in 1855, 4 years later, at the following World's Fair in Paris. The diamond stayed in the family, in the Hope family, for another 50 years, but the family's fortune was declining. In the 1890s, the owner was Francis Hope, and he met and married an American musical theater actress and singer called May Yohe. She had an international career at the turn of the century. She had begun her career on stages in New York City and Chicago, but she gained fame on the London stage. And she wore the diamond, or maybe a replica for safety, we don't exactly know, on several occasions. The story could make us think that she was financially supported by a millionaire husband, but it was actually the other way around. Francis Hope, who owned the diamond, was ruined and had accumulated debts that he couldn't repay. But the will of his ancestors prevented him from selling the stone, and it took years until 1901 before he could obtain permission to sell it. And in the meantime, he was supported by his wife. And when he could finally put the Hope diamond for sale, she had ran off with another gentleman. So Francis Hope sold the diamond to a London merchant who sold it to another dealer based in New York City. And this is how the Hope diamond crossed the Atlantic to America. It had spent the 17th century in India, the 18th in France, the 19th in Great Britain, and since the 20th century, it is in the United States. But in the years 1900, it briefly returned to Paris for a short time, because after its arrival in New York City, the diamond was sold again to a Turkish collector, possibly on behalf of the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, but this is uncertain. What is documented is that the diamond briefly returned to Paris, where it was bought by a famous jeweler, Pierre Cartier, a member of the Cartier family. His grandfather had founded the Cartier jewelry house. 2 years later, Cartier sold it to a wealthy American couple from Washington, D.C., the McLeans. The McLeans were as elite as you could be in America at the time. They both had a personal fortune, and the husband, Edward McLean, became the owner of the Washington Post a few years later. The wife, Evelyn McLean, was a mining heiress and a socialite. They acquired the gem in 1911, and it is during this period that the Hope diamond began to acquire this reputation of being cursed, because supposedly many of its previous owners had a tragic fate. We'll discuss that in a moment. It is not entirely impossible that the McLeans themselves fabricated concern about this supposed curse for publicity and maybe to increase the value of their investment. In any case, for 36 years, the Hope diamond remained in the hands of Evelyn McLean, and she wore it on many social occasions, surrounded with elaborate security precautions because it was one of the most valuable gemstones in the world. But the stone was not stolen during her ownership until she died in 1947. The diamond was then sold to settle her debts in 1949 to another famous jeweler, Harry Winston. He was at the same time a good businessman and an artist jeweler who redesigned a lot of old jewelry or set large gemstones into more contemporary styles. Almost 10 years later, Harry Winston donated it to the National Museum of Natural History in Washington, D.C., in the hope that it would help the United States establish a gem collection. He also donated another major diamond, the Portuguese diamond, which is a huge white or clear diamond of 127 carats, more than twice the Hope diamond. And this is how the Hope diamond ended in Washington, D.C., after centuries of troubles and tribulations. and maybe even more than what I just told you, because we have no trace of it before its appearance in India in 1666, but maybe it was found earlier. Now, I also told you that at the beginning of the 20th century, the diamond began to be surrounded by a mythology, a curse. It would bring misfortune or tragedy to people who own it or wear it. Accounts appeared in the press that it had been stolen from an eye of a statue of the Hindu goddess Sita. These were more rumors actually. They were and still are entirely baseless. And from this theft in India, a curse would have been born. This type of legend was very popular in the late 19th, early 20th centuries. You also probably heard of the curse of Tutankhamun. And what they have in common is that they use a few facts that could actually be just coincidences, or they are twisted to fit the narrative, and they add more facts that are just made up. And this ends up building a catchy story. If we take a look at the owners of the diamond, the first one was Jean-Baptiste Tavernier, the merchant who brought it from India. This trade actually made his fortune, and he died at 84, a very old age at the time. Then there was Louis XIV, the Sun King. After acquiring the stone from Tavernier, he had 47 more years of reign, with a few lows, but also many highs, and he died at 76. The next wearer was Louis XV, who died at 64, long after wearing the diamond. Then we have the first individuals who ended in tragedy, Louis XVI and Queen Marie-Antoinette. They were guillotined, beheaded, aged 38 and 37 respectively. But interestingly, at the time, the diamond stayed in a vault. There is no record of any of them ever wearing it. They probably saw it at some point, once or twice, but might not even have touched it. After them, the diamond might have belonged to King George IV. It is not entirely sure, but he died in 1830, aged 67, and his reign was not bad at all for the United Kingdom. Thomas Hope acquired it and died at 62, shortly after buying the diamond. So maybe here we have the beginning of something. The diamond stayed in the family until Francis Hope, who became the owner in 1884, and it is true that he went through bankruptcy and was forced to sell it. But he survived this and died 40 years later, in 1941. When Francis Hope was the owner, it was worn multiple times by May Yohe, the musical actress. She also survived long after, and she died at 72, even though she fell into poverty in her later years. Then the Ottoman Sultan may have owned it indirectly via a Turkish merchant, but this is not proven. Indeed, the Sultan lost his throne in 1909 and died 9 years later. The Hope diamond passed to Pierre Cartier. He just made a profit reselling it and died 54 years later in 1964, aged 86. The ownership did not seem to affect much the Macleans either. They divorced in 1932, 21 years after the purchase. Evelyn Maclean kept it, and she died in 1947 after 36 years of ownership. Then Harry Winston had it. He continued to prosper, And since he donated the diamond to the Smithsonian Institution, which manages the Natural History Museum, the institution has only prospered, and the museum has gained attendance, for a part thanks to the diamond. So, of course, some of the owners had problems. Statistically, it has to happen. But it is hard to see a pattern here. If there was a curse, it seems that it only worked for a few decades at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th. I would be tempted to say that this curse narrative was fabricated with the unhappy fates of other figures vaguely linked to the ownership of the diamond. For example, it was argued that under Louis XIV, one of his mistresses, Madame de Montespan, would have worn the diamond, and she ended up in disgrace. But there is no mention anywhere that she ever wore it. That would actually be impossible in public because she was a mistress, and the diamond was part of the crown jewels. She certainly saw it when the king wore the diamond, like hundreds of other people, but that's a very loose connection. And disgrace was the fate of every single royal mistress, so that's hardly exceptional. Another disgraced figure during the reign of Louis XIV was also mentioned, the finance minister Nicolas Fouquet, who was arrested and jailed for basically irritating the king because he showed off his wealth too much and he mixed his own finances with the kingdom's, not an unusual practice at the time. But as long as we know, Nicolas Fouquet never owned or wore the diamond. Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette were beheaded during the Revolution, more than a century later. But of all the owners, they were probably the least interested in the diamond, and probably never thought about it. So unless the diamond would have taken revenge for their lack of interest in it, it is also hard to see a curse at play here. So why did this curse legend emerge and remain famous to this day? Probably because it was encouraged by owners and former wearers of the diamond. I told you about the actress May Yohe. She tried to capitalize on her identity as the former wife of the last hope to own the diamond. She had misfortunes in her life, financial, sentimental, professional, and sometimes she blamed the stone for it. In the 1920s, she starred in a forgotten movie called The Mystery of the Hope Diamond. The film added more characters who would have fallen victims of the curse along history during the French Revolution and the 19th century. But it was all fictional. Newspapers helped spread this story. It was exciting and it sold, but it was all rumors and insinuations. There was never any hard evidence to it. And then Evelyn McLean also added her own narrative, adding more names to the list of past owners, like Catherine the Great of Russia, but this was entirely baseless. Now that the diamond has been with the Natural History Museum for decades, and nothing has happened, the curse story tends to slowly be forgotten, but from time to time it resurfaces in articles that examine the story to see what there is to it. And the conclusion is generally that there is not much, but it remains exciting. And there is no doubt that the Hope Diamond is not just a remarkable gem. It has crossed centuries and it has become a historical piece of great importance, which makes it priceless. Now, let's talk about another mythical diamond, and this time our story will begin in South Africa. This is the largest gem quality rough diamond ever found, the Cullinan Diamond. Historically, India was a major purveyor of diamonds, but in the 19th century, and even more in the 20th century, it was eclipsed by South Africa, where extremely rich deposits were found. In the last decades of the 20th century, mines popped up and great fortunes were built, sometimes from scratch, thanks to a combination of luck, smarts, and opportunism. This was the case of Thomas Cullinan, who was born in 1862 in the Cape Colony, not the heir of a mining empire at all. He worked as a bricklayer in Johannesburg, and like many others, when he could accumulate some money, he turned to prospecting. He was lucky to find diamonds. At the time there were places where they could be found on the surface, transported with soil that had been washed from diamond-bearing places. One day he found a diamond near a farm fence and deducted that it must have come from a particular rock hill that existed nearby. He managed to buy the land, and this acquisition turned out to be a jackpot, a very rich diamond mine on which he built his fortune. It is there that the biggest known diamond find ever happened in January 1905. A rough diamond weighing 3,106 carats, that's 620 grams or 22 ounces. It was found 18 feet below the surface. This diamond was 3 times bigger than the previous South African record, the Excelsior diamond, which weighed only 972 carats. There was no doubt that this stone had extraordinary value. It was so big and also of such good quality that it would be hard to sell. Many diamonds which are found are insufficiently perfect. They contain impurities. But this one was good enough to be considered of gem quality. Shortly after the discovery, it went on public display at a bank in Johannesburg, where a few thousand visitors came to see it. And then it was deposited with a sales agent who would take it to London, where it could be sold. The trip from South Africa to England was long, and the diamond could have attracted thieves because it had become instantly famous. So a steamboat was staffed with detectives, and a parcel that officially contained the stone was locked in the captain's safe and guarded on the entire journey. But it was just a decoy. The steamboat carried a fake, and the real diamond was sent to London in a plain box by mail. On arrival in London, it was carried to Buckingham Palace for inspection by the King, Edward VII. Initially, the diamond drew a lot of interest from potential buyers, and it was put on sale on the London market. But then, nothing happened. The diamond was just too big for jewelers. Buying it meant that it would have to be splitted into different pieces. That was frightening because the cost of buying the rough diamond was huge, and at the time no one was willing to take the risk. so it remained for sale for 2 years until the Transvaal Prime Minister from South Africa suggested that the colony should buy the diamond as a gift for Edward VII as a token of loyalty and attachment. And so it was done. The king accepted the gift, and the Cullinan Diamond joined the British crown jewels. At this point it was still rough, and not much more impressive than a block of glass visually. It had to be cut, and a gem cutter from Amsterdam, where it was a specialty, was appointed. Again, a ship carried an empty box across the North Sea to Amsterdam to throw off potential thieves when the diamond travelled by ferry and train in the pocket of the gem cutter who had discreetly travelled to London to receive it. Splitting a rough diamond of that size was a very hard task. It was easy to break, but for something of such high value, the breaking has to be planned. The size and shapes of different cuts must be anticipated to make the most out of it. The final cut and polished gems need to be symmetrical and look perfect. So before even starting to split it, sketches are made, and the stone is studied under every angle. Any bad move, and millions in value could vanish. So the splitting of the stone was planned for weeks, until it was decided to make 9 large stones out of it, plus almost 100 minor brilliants, smaller diamonds. These 9 stones have numbers, Cullinan 1, 2, 3, and so on, and each of them became a remarkable stone in its own right. So the largest one is Cullinan 1, also known as the Star of Africa. It weighs 530 carats, that's more than 10 times the Hope Diamond, and it has 74 facets. It was set at the top of the sovereign scepter, and to this day it remains the largest clear cut diamond in the world. Among cut diamonds, it was surpassed only by a brown diamond, the Golden Jubilee Diamond, in 1992, which was actually discovered in the same mine as the Cullinan. The Great Star of Africa is not completely perfect. It has very minor flaws, but they are invisible to the naked eye, and for a diamond of that size you cannot be too picky. The Cullinan II, sometimes called the Second Star of Africa, is a cushion-cut diamond. It is like a wide oval or a rectangle with curved sides, and it was set in the front of the imperial state crown. It weighs 317 carats and also is one of the largest cut diamonds in the world. The Cullinan III is pear-shaped, like a drop, and it weighs 94 carats. It is sometimes worn by Queen Elizabeth II as a brooch, together with Cullinan IV, which is square and weighs 64 carats. And then there are 5 more. In all, splitting and cutting these diamonds took 8 months, with 3 people working full-time on them to complete the task. Cullinan 1 and 2 are part of the British crown jewels, but the 7 following ones, which are less impressive but still of very high value, are owned personally by Elizabeth II. She inherited them from her grandmother, Queen Mary, in 1953. The Cullinan Diamond also produced almost 100 smaller diamonds and a set of fragments that remained unpolished. Some of them are also owned by Elizabeth II, and others have been dispersed, set on other jewels. Now, our third and last story of the night is not exactly about a gemstone, but it is an adjacent topic that you often requested. So let's do it. Let's explore the affair of the diamond necklace, which will take us back to France in the 18th century. Buckle up, because it sounds like a mix of crime thriller, farce and telenovela. But it's all real, it happened, and it was a huge scandal that sank the popularity of Queen Marie-Antoinette a few years before the French Revolution. But the story actually begins before she became queen, in 1772, at the court of King Louis XV. We already talked about him before, as one of the owners of the French Blue, the predecessor to the Hope Diamond. Louis XV always had mistresses. The most influential one during his reign was Madame de Pompadour, who was not born into the aristocracy but acquired all the codes of the court and became very influential. Not just in politics, she also became a patron of the arts, and she protected philosophers. Her peak as the official chief mistress of Louis XV was when she was in her late 20s, from 1745 to 1751. But even after, she remained a friend of the king and an influential figure. But as Louis XV advanced in his reign, he kept picking very young mistresses, typically in their 20s, who stood out increasingly for their looks and not necessarily anything else. And in the last years of the reign, the mistress-in-chief was Madame du Barry. She was not well liked, but even her detractors had to agree that she was extraordinarily attractive, beautiful. She had natural blonde hair, almond-shaped blue eyes, and very bubbly, funny personality. When Louis XV noticed her, she was 25, he was 53. And at this point in his life, old and disenchanted enough to disregard her past, because she was a courtesan, that is to say, a high-class prostitute, and her origins were very modest. She was the daughter of a seamstress and an unknown father. She had moved to Paris and come to the attention of a high-class pimp called Du Barry, who established her career as a courtesan in Parisian society. She built up a large aristocratic clientele, and occasionally she went to the court in Versailles, which is how Louis XV noticed her at first. She was charming and funny. She didn't have much culture at all, but her looks and her know-how in bed apparently made up for it, and the king completely fell for her. By the beginning of the 1770s, she had had a very impressive social rise. Louis XV could not have enough of her, and even though a large part of the court despised her, out of contempt for her origins, her behavior, and jealousy probably, especially Marie-Antoinette, who was not the queen yet, the king kept covering her of expensive gifts. In 1772, Louis XV decided to make her a very special gift, a diamond necklace that would surpass all others in cost, in size, and in splendor. The estimated cost was 2 million livres, which was a fortune, enough to build a palace or buy dozens of large houses, just for a necklace. But the jewelers would need several years to amass the appropriate set of diamonds, and 2 years after ordering the necklace, in 1774, Louis XV died of smallpox. Madame du Barry instantly lost her status at the court. Her sugar daddy was dead, basically, and she was immediately banished to never be seen again at Versailles. Louis XV had died very unpopular, but the new sovereigns, Louis XVI and Queen Marie-Antoinette, were very popular at the start. They represented change, they were young, they were good-looking, at least she was, and after the very long reign of Louis XV, their accession was seen as a new start. But the death of Louis XV was bad news for the jewelers. They had been working on this necklace since 1772, and they had already spent a fortune on diamonds, but now their client was gone. So they approached Louis XVI and Marie-Antoinette in 1778, trying to convince the king to buy the necklace as a gift for his wife. But the sale did not happen. The reasons are unclear. It could be that Marie-Antoinette had been asked to keep her spending in check. France had just entered the American War of Independence. Money was tight, and spending on over-the-top jewelry was not a good idea at the time politically. Or it could also be that Marie-Antoinette knew that the necklace had been created for du Barry, whom she very strongly disliked. But in any case, the jewelers were left with their necklace, so they tried to place it outside France for 3 years, but it was just too expensive, and again, in 1781, they tried with the Queen again, but she refused to buy it. Her early popularity had declined, and people now blamed her and her spending for financial issues that the kingdom was facing, which was quite unfair because it is true that she spent a lot and lived in a bubble completely disconnected from the reality of France, but at the scale of the state's budget, her spending was not that big, clearly not the main reason for financial troubles. In any case, it is in this configuration, in the 1780s, that what would become the affair of the necklace began to fall into place. And it happened entirely because of two characters. The first one was a woman, a confidence trickster, known as Jeanne de la Motte, who gravitated in aristocratic circles. She lived on a small pension, but had an appetite for money and recognition that made her try to gain wealth and approach the royals by any means possible. Jeanne de la Motte became the lover of our second character, the Cardinal de Rohan. Now, mistress of a cardinal, something sounds off because cardinals are not supposed to have romantic and sexual relationships. But it was not uncommon in the 18th century for members of the church who lived in the aristocracy. They didn't marry and were not supposed to have relationships, of course, but they could work as ambassadors, ministers. Some lived as courtiers. They were a very small minority within the clergy, but they were a part of social life in Versailles and Paris. The Rohan name was very prestigious. It was high and ancient nobility. And the Cardinal de Rohan had been an ambassador to the court of Vienna, the capital of Austria, which at the time was France's main ally. But the Cardinal was in a state of disgrace, especially in the eyes of Marie-Antoinette, because he had contributed to spread rumors about her in Vienna. This is where she came from. She was originally Austrian, and he had spoken ill of her mother. So the cardinal was desperate to regain the queen's trust and the queen's favor, and his new mistress made him believe that she had access to the inner circle of the queen, which was a lie. Marie-Antoinette barely knew her. But she managed to convince him that she could help him regain the queen's goodwill. And an elaborate scheme had begun to form in Jeanne de la Motte's mind. She was going to use the cardinal to execute it. She persuaded him that he could write to the queen, and she would pass the letters both ways. This was not true. She had no access to the queen, and when de Rohan wrote letters, she began to reply herself. The tone of the fake letters became warmer and warmer, to the point that the cardinal ended up suspecting that the queen was falling in love with him. He begged Jeanne de la Motte to organize a secret meeting, which was tricky, but she solved it by hiring a prostitute who looked a bit like Marie-Antoinette. De Rohan had never approached the queen from close, and she organized the meeting at night in a discreet part of the gardens at Versailles. The meeting took place. De Rohan totally believed that he had spoken to the queen, and Jeanne de la Motte now had him where she wanted. So she started plucking the chicken. First, she borrowed large sums of money from him, pretending they were for the queen's charity work. And of course, she never delivered the money. She lived comfortably with it. One day, she saw the possibility of an even bigger operation. She came into contact with the jewelers, who were still trying to sell their diamond necklace. In 1785, she told the cardinal that Marie-Antoinette wanted to buy this necklace. But she needed to do it discreetly, because buying such an expensive item in times of need would be politically clumsy. So she needed an intermediary, and asked him to be this person on behalf of the queen, or so she said. Jeanne de la Motte forged letters to make the claim believable, and de Rohan completely fell for it. He negotiated the purchase for the sum of 2 million livres, the price agreed on by Louis XV more than 10 years earlier. He didn't have the money, but the necklace was to be paid in installments, and he showed them the fakes made by Jeanne de la Motte as proof that the queen was behind the purchase, and the jewelers also believed him. Jeanne de la Motte convinced him that she would deliver the necklace to the queen, and fully trusting her, de Rohan gave it to her, more exactly to a man at Jeanne de la Motte's house, who he was made to believe was a valet of the queen. And of course, Jeanne de la Motte never delivered the necklace to Marie-Antoinette. She just picked it apart and sold the gems on the black market. That story could not end there, because the jewelers had not been paid, and had been made to believe that the queen was now their debitor. So when no payment happened, they complained to her, who had no idea all of this had been happening behind her back, and this is how the scandal began to unfold. An investigation began, and Rohan was arrested, to his surprise. It took him time to realize he had been tricked from the start. Jeanne de la Motte was arrested shortly after, as well as the prostitute who had played the role of Marie-Antoinette, and an expert in forgeries who had been hired by Jeanne de la Motte. He had written the fake Marie-Antoinette letters for her. At this point, the scandal was already too big to be hidden and settled privately. So, to the king and the queen's dismay, a trial had to take place, which would expose all the events publicly. The public opinion in 1786 had turned against the queen, and even though she was objectively blameless in this scandal, people were ready to believe that she really had tried to acquire the expensive necklace, and they suspected that the blame would be put on lesser people in a parody of trial. Despite findings to the contrary, the myth that the queen really had used Jeanne de la Motte as an intermediary to purchase the necklace became very widespread. She was already unpopular, but this affair buried her reputation for good. Rohan was acquitted. Indeed, he had been stupid but not dishonest. He didn't go to jail, but he was still exiled from the court, and his name was stained. Jeanne de la Motte actually managed to escape from her prison, and she took refuge in London. Her life remained really adventurous, and she kept doing her tricks. She died 5 years later in London, aged 35, and she died really as she had lived. She was trying to escape debt collectors, hiding inside a hotel, and she fell from a window. She injured herself and died from these injuries. 2 years later, in 1793, Marie-Antoinette was beheaded, and this affair contributed in no small part to the popular hate against her. The Cardinal de Rohan did better. He was completely disgraced and ridiculed, but 3 years after the scandal the revolution began, and this resetted everything. He was an aristocrat and a cardinal, two reasons to escape France when the revolution turned more radical. So he went into exile abroad, in Germany, where he died in 1803, aged 68. And this is how the affair of the diamond necklace ended, with the necklace destroyed and its gems dispersed. But we know what it looked like, thanks to sketches and drawings that were made when it was designed, and when the jewelers who made it were desperately trying to sell it. It was one of the most expensive and unique pieces of jewelry ever created. We have reached the end of our stories for tonight. I hope you liked them, and I'll talk to you soon with a new topic. In the meantime, you can let go and gently fall asleep. Sleep well. Sweet dreams. Au revoir.